A flight of hope and unseen challenges. Olivia James was exhausted but optimistic. The past week had been a whirlwind of meetings and presentations in New York. As a marketing executive, she was used to the constant demands of her career, but this trip had tested even her limits. Now, as she stood at the bustling JFK airport, she allowed herself a moment to look forward to the peace of her upcoming flight to Los Angeles. The trip would be a rare chance to unwind, gather her thoughts, and prepare for the challenges ahead. She had splurged on a first-class ticket, a small luxury she rarely indulged in. Olivia had worked hard for her success and had earned the occasional indulgence. The promise of a spacious seat, attentive service, and a quiet cabin seemed like the perfect way to decompress. The boarding process was chaotic, as usual. Passengers crowded the gate, clutching their boarding passes and jostling for position. Olivia waited patiently, double-checking her ticket. Row 2, Seat A. She had specifically chosen this window seat, picturing herself gazing at the clouds while sipping a glass of wine. Finally, her boarding group was called. Olivia straightened her blazer, grabbed her carry-on, and walked confidently down the jet bridge. She was ready to put the stress of the week behind her. As she entered the plane, the atmosphere shifted. The first-class cabin was an oasis of calm compared to the crowded gate area. Olivia smiled as she made her way down the aisle, scanning the seat numbers. When she reached row 2, her heart sank. A flight attendant was standing in front of her seat, clipboard in hand, her expression tight. "Excuse me," Olivia said politely. "I believe this is my seat." She held up her boarding pass. The flight attendant, a tall woman with impeccably styled blonde hair, looked up and gave Olivia a once-over. Her smile was thin, almost rehearsed. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said in a tone that was firm but polite. "This seat has been assigned to another passenger. Please take a seat in the main cabin." Olivia blinked, taken aback. "There must be some mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. She handed the attendant her boarding pass. "It clearly says row 2, Seat A." The flight attendant glanced at the boarding pass, but didn't take it. Her expression hardened. "I'm afraid this seat is no longer available. You'll need to move to a different one." A ripple of unease coursed through Olivia. She had flown many times before and had never encountered such a situation. Her first instinct was to reason with the woman. "With all due respect," Olivia said, keeping her tone steady, "I paid for this seat in advance. There's no reason I should have to move." By now, a few nearby passengers had taken notice. Some glanced up from their phones or newspapers, while others pretended not to listen but clearly were. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their stares. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, lowering her voice slightly, "I don't want to make this a bigger issue. Please cooperate and take another seat." Olivia could feel her frustration building. This wasn't about the seat anymore. The dismissive tone, the refusal to acknowledge her valid boarding pass, it all felt pointed. "I'm not trying to cause a problem," Olivia said, her voice still calm but firmer now. "I just want to sit in the seat I paid for." The tension in the cabin grew palpable. Other passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued by the escalating exchange. Olivia felt the weight of their eyes on her, but she refused to back down. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Olivia said. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed slightly. She hesitated, then turned and gestured toward the front of the cabin. Moments later, a senior flight attendant appeared, a man in his late 40s with a calm, professional demeanor. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Olivia and the flight attendant. Olivia explained the situation, showing him her boarding pass. The senior attendant examined it, his brow furrowing slightly. He looked at the first flight attendant, who seemed to stiffen under his gaze. "Ma'am," he said to Olivia, "I'll need a moment to sort this out. Please step aside." Olivia moved to the side of the aisle, clutching her carry-on. She felt a knot of anxiety forming in her chest. She hated causing a scene, but this was about more than just a seat. It was about fairness, about standing up for herself. As she waited, she noticed the way the other passengers looked at her. Some were curious, others indifferent. A few seemed to make assumptions based solely on her appearance. Olivia had experienced this kind of subtle bias before. Being the successful black woman in a predominantly white industry came with its challenges, but it never got easier. Minutes passed, and the senior attendant returned. His expression was unreadable as he spoke. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," he said. "We're working to resolve it. But for now, I'll need you to sit in a different seat." Olivia's patience was wearing thin. "With all due respect," she said, her voice firm, "this isn't a misunderstanding. My ticket clearly states that this is my seat. I'm not moving until this is resolved." The senior attendant exchanged a glance with the first flight attendant. There was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his tone softening slightly, "please bear with us. I assure you, we'll resolve this shortly." Olivia nodded, but she wasn't convinced. She took a seat in an empty row nearby, her carry-on still at her feet. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their silent judgments hanging in the air. As she sat there, waiting for answers, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than a simple mistake. Something deeper was at play, and she was determined to find out what. Little did she know, the next 8 minutes would change everything. The ripple effect begins. Olivia sat quietly in the temporary seat she'd taken, her emotions simmering just below the surface. Her carry-on sat at her feet, a silent testament to the disruption she was enduring. Her fingers tapped nervously against the armrest as her mind raced to process what had just unfolded. Why was her seat reassigned? Why had the flight attendant been so dismissive? And why did she feel like the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed? She tried to maintain her composure. Olivia had faced many challenges in her life, and she'd always prided herself on her ability to stay calm under pressure. But this felt different. It wasn't just the inconvenience or the public scrutiny from the passengers around her. It was the creeping sense that her presence in first class was being questioned in a way that went beyond logistics. The senior flight attendant returned, clipboard in hand, his expression carefully neutral. He stopped beside Olivia and leaned down slightly. "Ma'am, we're still sorting through the seating arrangement. Please remain seated here for now," he said, his tone polite but clipped. Olivia nodded, biting back the urge to demand more information. She watched as the senior attendant walked back toward the front of the plane, where the first flight attendant stood with her arms crossed, avoiding eye contact with Olivia. They exchanged a few quiet words, their body language tense. Passengers nearby began whispering to each other. Olivia could feel their glances, their curiosity. Some seemed to offer her sympathetic looks, while others appeared to dismiss her entirely. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the quiet resolve building inside her, a deeper tension in the air. As she waited, Olivia's thoughts turned inward. This wasn't the first time she had felt out of place in a space she had worked hard to belong to. From corporate boardrooms to exclusive events, there were always subtle reminders that some people didn't think she belonged. Sometimes it was a lingering look, a hesitated handshake, or a condescending comment disguised as a compliment. But this, being denied her seat in front of an entire cabin, felt like an entirely new level of dismissal. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a mantra Olivia had grown up hearing. "You don't have to be twice as good to prove yourself. You already belong." Olivia had carried those words with her through every step of her journey, using them as a shield against the world's biases. But shields only worked so well when the attacks were so blatant. An unexpected disruption. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as a man entered the plane, flanked by 2 airline staff members. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, and his demeanor screamed importance. Olivia watched as he approached the first-class cabin, scanning the rows. The first flight attendant immediately perked up, greeting the man with a wide smile. Her demeanor shifted entirely, no longer tense, but eager, almost obsequious. Olivia's stomach churned as the pieces started to come together. The man stopped at row 2, and glanced at the empty seat by the window. Olivia's seat. The first flight attendant gestured toward it, speaking in a low, hurried tone that Olivia couldn't make out. It hit her like a freight train. The seat hadn't been reassigned because of a clerical error. It had been reassigned because someone decided this man was more deserving of it. Olivia felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had paid for that seat, planned for it, expected it. And now, it seemed, her claim to it had been erased by someone's assumption that this man's presence in first class mattered more. Olivia takes a stand. She stood up, her frustration bubbling over. The senior flight attendant, who had been hovering nearby, turned to her with a wary expression. "Excuse me," Olivia said, her voice steady but firm. "I think I deserve an explanation. That's my seat. Why is someone else being directed to it?" The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Even the man in the suit paused, his eyes darting toward Olivia. "Ma'am," the senior attendant began, his voice placating, "we're doing our best to resolve the situation. Please remain seated." "No," Olivia interrupted, her tone sharper now. "I've been patient. I've cooperated, but I've had enough. This is my seat, and I want to know why I'm being told I can't sit there." The first flight attendant's expression tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, the senior attendant stepped forward, raising a hand as if to calm her. "Let's not escalate this further," he said. Olivia couldn't help but laugh, a bitter sound that surprised even her. "Escalate? I'm not escalating anything. I'm asking for the seat I paid for. The only people escalating this are your staff, who seem to think I don't belong here." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The man in the suit shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to be dragged into the confrontation. A cabin divided. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Some passengers avoided looking at Olivia altogether, while others watched with quiet approval. A woman across the aisle gave her a small nod, as if to say, "I see you." The senior flight attendant looked at Olivia, his composure slipping slightly. "Ma'am, I'll speak to the captain and see what we can do. Please, take your seat for now." "Which seat?" Olivia shot back. "The one I paid for, or the one you're trying to shove me into because you think someone else deserves mine more?" The man hesitated, then gestured for her to follow him. "Come with me," he said quietly. Behind closed doors, Olivia followed him toward the front of the plane. Past the curious stares of the other passengers, he led her into the small galley area near the cockpit, where they were out of earshot. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "this is a misunderstanding. The airline sometimes makes decisions based on priority passengers. It's not personal." Olivia crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "It feels personal. Do you know how this looks? How it feels? I've flown first class before, and I've never been treated like this." The senior attendant rubbed his temples, clearly flustered. "I understand your frustration, but this isn't about." "It is about something," Olivia cut in. "Because if it were just about logistics, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd be fixing this, not making excuses." The man sighed, glancing toward the cockpit as if hoping for backup. But Olivia wasn't letting him off the hook. "The decision." After a long pause, the senior attendant spoke. "Let me speak to the captain. Please wait here." He disappeared into the cockpit, leaving Olivia alone in the galley. She leaned against the counter, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing: she wasn't backing down. Minutes later, the senior attendant returned, his expression grim. "We've decided to honor your ticket," he said. "You'll be seated in row 2, seat A as originally planned." Olivia felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by frustration. It shouldn't have taken this much effort. The senior attendant continued, his tone formal. "I apologize for the inconvenience. We'll address the matter internally." Olivia nodded curtly, then returned to the cabin. She walked to row 2, her back straight and her head held high. The man in the suit had been moved elsewhere, and the first flight attendant avoided her gaze entirely. As Olivia settled into her seat, she couldn't help but notice the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up against the quiet injustices that so often went unchallenged. And while the immediate issue had been resolved, Olivia knew the ripples of this encounter were far from over. The eyes of the cabin. Olivia exhaled deeply as she settled into row 2. Seat A. The ordeal had been exhausting, but she had stood her ground and reclaimed what was rightfully hers. However, the tension in the air lingered like a storm cloud. The first-class cabin was no longer the serene oasis she had envisioned. It had become a stage, with her as the reluctant lead. Passengers stole glances her way, their faces painted with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. She could feel their unspoken questions hanging in the air. Why had she made such a fuss? Was it worth it? Who was in the wrong? Olivia wanted to retreat into herself, to plug in her headphones and pretend none of it had happened. But she couldn't shake the feeling that even now she was being judged, not for her actions, but for what she represented. The first flight attendant, whom Olivia now knew as Sarah thanks to her name tag, hovered near the front of the cabin, her movements stiff and mechanical. Gone was the air of authority she had exuded earlier. Sarah now seemed unsure of herself, casting wary glances at Olivia as she went about her duties. The shift in dynamics. The senior flight attendant, Mr. Walker, approached Olivia once more. He leaned in slightly, his tone quieter than before. "Ma'am, I wanted to let you know that the captain has been informed of the situation. We appreciate your understanding." Olivia nodded curtly. "I'm glad you've decided to address it. It should never have happened in the first place." Walker straightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He offered a polite nod before stepping away, clearly eager to diffuse the tension but unsure how. Olivia watched him retreat, her thoughts swirling. It was clear that Walker and Sarah had underestimated her resolve. They had likely expected her to quietly comply, to avoid drawing attention to herself. But Olivia had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where she wasn't always welcome. Compliance wasn't an option anymore. A conversation begins. As the flight attendants resumed their tasks, a woman seated across the aisle leaned toward Olivia. She was in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair and a warm smile that carried a hint of encouragement. "Good for you," the woman said softly, her voice low enough not to carry. Olivia looked at her, surprised. "Excuse me?" "For standing up for yourself," the woman clarified. "I saw the whole thing. It's not easy to do what you did." Olivia's shoulders relaxed slightly. She hadn't expected support, especially from a stranger. "Thank you," she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. The woman nodded. "It's sad that it had to happen at all, but maybe it'll make them think twice next time." Olivia smiled faintly, appreciating the sentiment. She had no illusions that her actions would spark systemic change, but it was comforting to know that at least one person understood the weight of what had transpired. A moment of reflection. As the plane taxied to the runway, Olivia allowed herself a moment to reflect. She thought back to the countless times she had experienced moments like this, subtle but unmistakable acts of bias that left her questioning her place in the world. This time, though, it had been more overt. The boarding pass in her hand was a tangible piece of evidence that she belonged in that seat. And yet, Sarah's behavior had suggested otherwise, as if Olivia needed to prove herself in a way no other first-class passenger did. Olivia's mind wandered to the man in the suit who had been redirected to another seat. She wondered if he had realized what was happening, if he had noticed the power dynamics at play. Had he been complicit, or merely a pawn in a situation he didn't fully understand? Unspoken conversations. The plane's engines roared to life, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft lifted off. The familiar sensation of takeoff, the slight pull, the weightless ascent, should have been a comforting reminder that the worst was over. But Olivia couldn't relax. Across the aisle, a younger man with headphones around his neck turned toward her. His face was apologetic. "I saw what happened," he said in a hushed tone. "That was messed up." Olivia gave him a small nod. It was. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I hope you know that not everyone here agrees with how they treated you. Thank you, Olivia replied, her tone sincere. It means a lot. As the man turned back to his tablet, Olivia felt a flicker of hope. Not everyone in the cabin had turned a blind eye. Maybe this experience would leave an impression on more than just her. The first-class club. The remainder of the flight began to settle into the expected rhythm. Drinks were served, meal orders were taken, and the cabin lights dimmed for the evening service. Olivia noticed the distinct shift in Sarah's demeanor as she approached the first-class passengers. She was polite but distant, her usual warmth replaced by a professional coldness. When Sarah reached Olivia's row, she hesitated, her tray of drinks shaking slightly in her hands. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "A glass of red wine, please," Olivia said evenly, meeting Sarah's gaze. Sarah nodded and poured the wine without a word, then moved on to the next passenger. Olivia could feel the tension radiating from her, and she couldn't help but wonder what was going through Sarah's mind. Had she realized the gravity of her actions? Did she regret how she had handled the situation? Or was she simply angry at having been called out? A brewing storm. The cabin returned to a state of uneasy calm, but Olivia could tell that the tension hadn't dissipated entirely. It lingered in the way the flight attendants avoided eye contact with her, in the way some passengers still cast furtive glances in her direction. She sipped her wine and opened her laptop, hoping to distract herself with work, but her mind refused to cooperate. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the last hour, dissecting every interaction, every word, every look. She glanced at her phone, which she had switched to airplane mode before takeoff. For a moment, she considered writing about the experience, sharing it on social media, where she knew her network would understand. But she hesitated. Once the story was out there, it would no longer be hers alone. The breaking point. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting Olivia from her thoughts. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her seat, staring out the window. The city lights below were faint, a reminder of how small everything seemed from above. In that moment, she made a decision. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. It was about the assumptions that shaped the way people were treated, often without them even realizing it. Olivia didn't know what the next step would be, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let this moment fade into obscurity. It was time for her voice to be heard. As the plane cruised through the night sky, Olivia sat upright, her resolve hardening. The flight wasn't over, and neither was her journey. This was only the beginning. The catalyst of change. Olivia's resolve to make her voice heard grew stronger as the hours dragged on. She sat upright in her first-class seat, sipping the remnants of her wine and staring blankly at the tablet on her tray table. The in-flight movie played silently in front of her, but she couldn't focus. Her thoughts were consumed by the events leading up to this moment and the ripple effects they seemed destined to create. The cabin was now dimly lit, most passengers reclining in their seats or scrolling through their devices. Yet Olivia could feel the undercurrent of tension that lingered in the air. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, an invisible weight pressing down on her and everyone around her. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Sarah was quietly speaking with Mr. Walker. The conversation was brief, but Olivia noticed the way Sarah's shoulders slumped as she walked away. Something about the scene struck her as odd, more than simple frustration. The crew's whispered words. Minutes later, Olivia's attention was drawn to another hushed conversation. Sarah and Mr. Walker were speaking again, this time near the galley, their words quiet but their body language betraying them. Sarah gestured toward Olivia's seat, her expression taut with frustration. Mr. Walker seemed to be speaking calmly, his hands raised in a placating gesture, but Sarah's agitation only grew. Olivia's stomach tightened. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. The incident wasn't over. It wasn't just a misunderstanding about her seat. It had become something bigger, something the crew was struggling to contain. She pulled out her phone, switching it to the offline note-taking app. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she debated what to write. She wanted to document everything while it was fresh in her mind. If the flight crew thought she would let this go quietly, they were mistaken. The unexpected apology. A shadow fell over her tray table, and Olivia looked up to see Sarah standing there, her expression unreadable. "Ms. James," Sarah began, her voice quieter than before, "I'd like to apologize for earlier. I realize now that the situation could have been handled differently." Olivia arched an eyebrow. The apology was unexpected, but it felt rehearsed, mechanical. She folded her hands in her lap and met Sarah's gaze. "Could have been handled differently," Olivia repeated. "That's an understatement. You dismissed me, invalidated my ticket, and tried to force me into another seat, all without explanation. And now, after all that, you're offering a vague apology." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, and she straightened her posture. "I understand how it may have seemed, but I was following protocol. It wasn't personal." "Not personal," Olivia said, her voice calm but sharp. "You made it personal the moment you decided I didn't belong in this seat. Protocol or not, you could have addressed the issue without dismissing me outright." Sarah hesitated, her composure wavering. She glanced at the passengers nearby, some of whom were watching with thinly veiled interest. "I'm truly sorry," Sarah said finally, her tone softening. "It won't happen again." Olivia studied her for a moment, searching for sincerity in her expression. She wasn't sure if Sarah's apology was genuine or simply a means to diffuse the situation. Either way, it wasn't enough. "Thank you," Olivia said curtly. "But I'm not the only one you owe an apology to. You owe one to everyone who's ever been treated like they didn't belong." Sarah's eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, or recognition. She gave a small nod before walking away, her steps heavy with something unspoken. The passenger alliance. As the flight continued, Olivia found herself increasingly aware of the passengers around her. It became clear that the incident had created an invisible divide in the cabin. Some passengers seemed sympathetic, offering her quiet nods or smiles as they passed. Others avoided her entirely, their discomfort evident in the way they averted their gazes. At one point, the woman across the aisle, the same one who had earlier expressed her support, leaned toward Olivia again. "You know," the woman said, her voice low, "I've been flying for decades and I've seen things like this happen more times than I can count. But I've never seen anyone handle it as gracefully as you did." Olivia smiled faintly, the compliment feeling both welcome and bittersweet. "Thank you, but I didn't feel very graceful in the moment." "That's the thing about situations like this," the woman replied. "They're not meant to make you feel graceful. They're meant to make you feel small, and you didn't let that happen." The woman's words struck a chord, and Olivia nodded slowly. She hadn't thought about it that way, but it was true. The entire encounter had been designed to strip her of her dignity, her confidence, and yet here she was, still standing, or rather, sitting. The viral moment. Olivia glanced at her phone again, the urge to share her story growing stronger. She opened her social media app and began typing, recounting the events with as much clarity and detail as she could muster. She hesitated for a moment before hitting save. She wasn't ready to post it yet. Not here, not now. But she knew the story needed to be told, and she wanted to be the one to tell it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion toward the back of the plane. A passenger from economy class had walked up to the first-class cabin, his phone raised. He stopped near Olivia's seat, his gaze fixed on her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Are you the woman who was told to move earlier?" Olivia blinked, caught off guard by the sudden attention. "Yes, I am," she replied cautiously. The man's face lit up with a mix of sympathy and determination. "I heard about what happened. That's not right. I've got the whole thing recorded." For a moment, Olivia wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't even realized someone had been filming the interaction. The man's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. "Looks like it's already going viral," he said, showing her the video. The clip was short but damning. It showed Sarah blocking Olivia's path to her seat, her tone firm and dismissive. The comments below were already piling up, a mix of outrage and debate. Olivia felt a pang of unease. This was bigger than she had anticipated. The video was out there now, and she couldn't control how people interpreted it. The unfolding fallout. As the flight neared its destination, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted again. The crew seemed more tense than ever, their smiles strained as they went through the motions of preparing for landing. Olivia closed her eyes, trying to center herself. She knew the next few hours, and possibly days, would be intense. The video would spark conversations she couldn't avoid, and the fallout could be unpredictable. But as the plane began its descent, Olivia felt a strange sense of calm. She had stood her ground, reclaimed her dignity, and refused to let bias go unchallenged. Whatever came next, she was ready. This was more than a seat on a plane. It was a battle for respect, for fairness, and for the right to exist in spaces where she had every right to be. And Olivia James wasn't about to back down. The aftermath unfolds. The wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac with a gentle thud, signaling the end of the long and turbulent flight. Olivia sat still, her hands clasped tightly around the armrests, her heart pounding despite the smooth landing. The events of the past few hours replayed in her mind like a loop she couldn't turn off. The incident had started as a simple refusal to let her sit in the first-class seat she had paid for, but it had morphed into something far greater. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Olivia couldn't ignore the muted buzz of activity around her. Passengers were shifting in their seats, gathering their belongings, and stealing glances in her direction. Some offered her brief nods of acknowledgement or solidarity, while others avoided her altogether. Her phone, now switched back to cellular mode, buzzed incessantly with notifications. The video captured by the economy-class passenger was spreading faster than she could have anticipated. Social media, it seemed, had already latched onto the story, and the world beyond the confines of the plane was starting to take notice. Olivia glanced out the window, taking in the sprawling lights of Los Angeles. She had arrived, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey was far from over. A message from the captain. Before the seatbelt sign turned off, the voice of the captain crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. On behalf of the entire crew, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We understand there were some unexpected challenges during the flight, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. For those directly affected, please know that we'll be following up with you personally to ensure your concerns are addressed. Thank you again for choosing to fly with us." The words were vague, carefully worded to avoid acknowledging specifics, but Olivia felt the underlying weight of them. The airline knew they were in trouble. The waiting eyes. As the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Olivia stood to retrieve her carry-on. She could feel the eyes of other passengers following her movements. Some were subtle in their observations, while others openly stared, their expressions a mix of curiosity and awkwardness. The woman across the aisle smiled gently at Olivia. "You handled that with grace," she said, her voice low but warm. "Thank you," Olivia replied, her voice equally soft. She appreciated the sentiment, but it did little to quell the nerves stirring inside her. The passengers in the rows ahead began filing out, but Olivia waited, letting the crowd thin before stepping into the aisle. She didn't want to linger in the enclosed space of the plane any longer than necessary. A storm of attention. As Olivia exited the jet bridge and stepped into the terminal, she was met with an unexpected sight. A small group of reporters, cameras at the ready, stood near the gate. Their presence caught her off guard, and for a moment, she froze. One of the reporters spotted her and immediately approached, microphone extended. "Ms. James, can we get a comment on what happened during your flight?" The reporter asked, her tone eager but not aggressive. Olivia felt a rush of panic. She wasn't prepared for this. Not yet. She hadn't even had time to fully process what had happened, let alone articulate it to the world. "No comment," Olivia said firmly, stepping past the reporter. She kept her head high, her stride purposeful, as she moved through the terminal. But the reporters weren't the only ones paying attention. Other travelers glanced at her as she passed, some whispering to each other, others discreetly raising their phones. Olivia felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her, a reminder that her private ordeal had become very public. The call that changed everything. By the time Olivia reached the baggage claim area, her phone was buzzing nonstop. She ignored most of the notifications, but one caught her eye. A message from a colleague, Michelle, who worked in public relations. "Olivia, I saw the video. Are you okay? Call me when you land. We need to talk about how to handle this." Olivia dialed Michelle's number, her hands trembling slightly. The phone rang twice before Michelle picked up. "Olivia," Michelle said, her voice a mix of concern and urgency. "I've been following what's happening. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Olivia replied, though she didn't entirely believe it herself. "It's been a lot to process." "I can imagine," Michelle said. "Listen, this story is already making waves. News outlets are picking it up, and the comments on social media are blowing up. You need to think about how you want to approach this." "What do you mean?" Olivia asked, her brow furrowing. "You have a platform now," Michelle said. "People are listening. This isn't just about what happened to you. It's about something bigger. You have the chance to shine a light on how bias and discrimination can show up in everyday situations, even on something as seemingly mundane as a flight." Olivia was silent for a moment, letting Michelle's words sink in. She hadn't asked for this attention, but now that it was here, she couldn't ignore it. "What do you think I should do?" Olivia asked finally. "First, take a breath," Michelle said gently. "Then think about your message. If you want to speak out, do it on your terms. Be clear, honest, and authentic. And remember, you don't owe anyone your story unless you're ready to share it." The weight of the choice. After hanging up with Michelle, Olivia sat down on one of the benches near the baggage carousel. Her carry-on rested at her feet, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was too busy grappling with the enormity of the situation. She opened her phone again, scrolling through the notifications. The video had already been shared thousands of times, with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #EqualityInFlight trending on social media. Comments ranged from outrage at the airline's behavior to praise for Olivia's courage in standing up for herself. But there were also comments questioning her actions, accusing her of overreacting or seeking attention. Those stung the most, even though she knew they weren't true. A chance encounter. As Olivia sat lost in thought, a young woman approached her hesitantly. She was wearing a college sweatshirt and clutching a small rolling suitcase. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. "I just wanted to say thank you." Olivia looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For standing up for yourself," the woman said. "I've been in situations like that before, and I didn't have the courage to speak up. Seeing you do it, it gives me hope." Olivia felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That means a lot." The young woman nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "You're making a difference. I hope you know that." As the woman walked away, Olivia felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, pride, and a deep sense of responsibility. She hadn't asked to be thrust into the spotlight, but now that she was here, she couldn't ignore the impact her actions were having. A new resolve. By the time Olivia's suitcase appeared on the carousel, she had made up her mind. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had faced similar situations, but didn't have the opportunity or platform to push back. She would speak out, not for attention, but for change. She would share her story, not to relive the pain, but to highlight the issues that needed addressing. And she would do it on her own terms. As she exited the terminal and stepped into the cool Los Angeles night, Olivia felt a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Her voice mattered, and she was ready to use it. Speaking out. The drive from the airport to Olivia's hotel was quiet, giving her ample time to think. She stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, her mind racing. The events on the flight had left her rattled, but the reaction afterward had sparked something deeper. She was beginning to realize just how much weight her story carried, not just for herself, but for others who had faced similar treatment in silence. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was another message from Michelle. News outlets are reaching out for comments. You don't have to respond right away, but we need to talk about how you want to handle this. Call me when you're ready. Olivia sighed, a mix of exhaustion and resolve filling her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face the world, but she also knew the longer she waited, the more the narrative would spiral out of her control. The first steps. Once she reached her hotel room, Olivia set her suitcase aside and sank into the armchair by the window. She gazed out at the sprawling cityscape, her thoughts settling into clarity. She picked up her phone and opened her social media app. The notifications were overwhelming. Hundreds of comments, retweets, and shares. She took a deep breath and began typing. I didn't expect today to unfold the way it did. What started as a simple flight turned into something much bigger, a moment that highlighted the quiet biases so many of us face every day. I want to share my story, not for attention, but because I know I'm not alone in this experience. To everyone who has reached out with support, thank you. And to those who question why I spoke up, here's why. Sometimes you have to take a stand, not just for yourself, but for everyone who deserves better. #equality in flight #, speak out. She hesitated for a moment, then hit post. The words were out there now, and there was no taking them back. But instead of fear, Olivia felt a strange sense of relief. She had taken control of the narrative. The morning after. The next morning, Olivia woke to find her post had gone viral. Thousands of likes and shares flooded her notifications, and the comments ranged from supportive to skeptical. People from all walks of life were weighing in, some praising her courage, others questioning her motives. One comment stood out to her. Thank you for speaking out. This happens far too often, and it's time for change. You're inspiring more people than you know. Olivia smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. She wasn't just reacting to what had happened, she was starting a conversation. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Michelle. Morning, Michelle said, her voice calm but purposeful. Have you seen the response to your post? I have, Olivia replied. It's overwhelming, but I think I did the right thing. You absolutely did, Michelle said. Now we need to strategize. News outlets are reaching out, and there's a lot of momentum. If you're willing, we can start framing this as part of a larger issue. Bias in service industries, systemic inequalities, all of it. Olivia nodded, even though Michelle couldn't see her. I want to do that, she said. But I want to make sure it's not just about me. This is bigger than one person. I couldn't agree more, Michelle said. Let's set up a time to talk in detail. In the meantime, be prepared for the spotlight. This is going to get bigger. The airline's response. Later that afternoon, Olivia received an email from the airline. The subject line read, Our deepest apologies. She opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. ***, Dear Ms. James, on behalf of our airline, we want to express our sincerest apologies for the unacceptable experience you endured on your recent flight. Our goal is to provide exceptional service to all passengers, and it is clear we fell short. We take this matter very seriously and have initiated an internal review to ensure incidents like this do not occur in the future. Additionally, we would like to offer you a complimentary round-trip ticket to any destination of your choice as a gesture of goodwill. Please do not hesitate to reach out if there is anything further we can do to address your concerns. Sincerely, Customer Relations Team ****. Olivia's lips tightened as she read the email. It was polite and professionally worded, but it felt hollow, like a PR move designed to smooth over bad press, rather than a genuine attempt to address the root of the issue. She forwarded the email to Michelle with a brief note. "We need to address this." The news interview. The following day, Olivia found herself seated in a brightly lit studio, a microphone clipped to her blouse. Across from her sat a journalist for a national morning show, their expression both empathetic and curious. "Thank you for joining us, Ms. James," the journalist began. "Your story has sparked a national conversation about bias and equality in customer service. Can you tell us what was going through your mind during the incident?" Olivia took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "At first, I thought it was a simple mistake, a clerical error or miscommunication. But as the situation unfolded, it became clear that it was about more than that. It was about assumptions, about who belongs in certain spaces and who doesn't." The journalist nodded. "Do you believe this incident was racially motivated?" "I believe it was shaped by unconscious bias," Olivia replied. "Whether intentional or not, the way I was treated sent a clear message that I didn't belong in first class, despite having every right to be there. And that's a message too many people of color receive in subtle and not so subtle ways every day." The journalist leaned forward slightly. "What do you hope comes out of this conversation?" "I hope it leads to change," Olivia said firmly. "Not just in how airlines operate, but in how we address bias across all industries. It's not enough to apologize after the fact. We need to create systems and cultures that prevent these incidents from happening in the first place." The domino effect. The interview aired the next morning, and the response was immediate. Social media exploded with hashtags like #StandWithOlivia and #BiasInService, and more people began sharing their own stories of discrimination and bias. The conversation expanded, touching on issues of race, gender, class, and privilege. Olivia found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't anticipated but fully embraced. She spoke at panels, participated in webinars, and worked with advocacy groups to push for concrete changes in how industries train their employees. The airline issued a follow-up statement, announcing new training programs and policies aimed at combating bias. While some applauded the move, others criticized it as too little, too late. Through it all, Olivia remained steadfast. She hadn't sought out this spotlight, but now that she was in it, she was determined to use it for good. A personal victory. One evening, as Olivia sat in her apartment reflecting on the whirlwind of events, she received an email from a young woman she didn't know. ***Hey Olivia. I just wanted to thank you for sharing your story. I'm a college student studying law, and I've faced similar situations where I felt like I didn't belong. Seeing you stand up for yourself has inspired me to do the same. You've reminded me that my voice matters, and I'll carry that with me as I pursue my dreams. Thank you for being brave." Olivia's eyes welled with tears as she read the message. It was a reminder of why she had chosen to speak out, not for herself, but for every person who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or out of place. She leaned back in her chair, a quiet smile spreading across her face. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth it. And she knew her work was far from over. Building bridges, breaking barriers. Months had passed since Olivia's story first went viral. What began as an uncomfortable confrontation on a flight had spiraled into a national conversation about bias, privilege, and the hidden dynamics of everyday interactions. Olivia found herself thrust into a role she had never sought but had fully embraced, a voice for change. Her days were now filled with interviews, speaking engagements, and collaborations with advocacy groups. The airline's public apology had sparked internal changes, but Olivia had pushed for more. She worked alongside diversity and inclusion experts to create actionable policies, not just for the airline but for other companies that reached out after her story gained traction. Despite the whirlwind of activity, Olivia remained grounded. Every email she received from strangers sharing their own stories, every event she spoke at, and every meeting she attended reminded her of the importance of what she was doing. A global platform. One chilly morning in Washington, D.C., Olivia stood backstage at a major conference on systemic inequality in customer service industries. The crowd was larger than any she had faced before. Thousands of attendees in person, with many more watching the livestream. Her name was now synonymous with pushing for equality in the spaces where discrimination often went unnoticed. As the event coordinator gave her a signal, Olivia stepped onto the stage. The applause was immediate and thunderous, a wave of support that filled the expansive auditorium. She smiled, took a breath, and approached the podium. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady but heartfelt. "A few months ago, I was just another passenger on a flight, expecting nothing more than to get to my destination. I never imagined that one experience, one refusal of my seat, would lead me here today." She paused, scanning the crowd. "But the truth is, what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't unique. It was a reflection of a deeper issue. A system that, consciously or unconsciously, decides who belongs and who doesn't. And that system isn't just in the skies. It's in our workplaces, our schools, our neighborhoods. It's everywhere." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. "What I've learned through this experience," Olivia continued, "is that speaking up is hard. It's uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. Because if we don't speak up, nothing changes, and change is long overdue." Her speech went on to highlight the progress that had been made since her flight: new bias training programs, updated company policies, and a growing awareness of the subtle but pervasive ways discrimination manifests. But she also emphasized how much work remained to be done. "We've taken steps," she said in closing, "but steps are not enough. We need to keep moving forward, together. Because change doesn't come from one person or one story. It comes from all of us, united in the belief that equality isn't just an ideal. It's a right." The applause that followed was deafening, a standing ovation that brought tears to Olivia's eyes. Personal growth. Away from the public eye, Olivia was grappling with her own transformation. The months since the incident had been an emotional roller coaster, forcing her to confront not only the biases she had experienced, but also the way she had internalized them over the years. She sought solace in therapy, working through the lingering effects of being in the spotlight. She also leaned heavily on her support network, friends, family, and colleagues who had stood by her through every twist and turn. One evening, as she sat in her apartment with her best friend, Maya, Olivia opened up about her fears. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," Olivia admitted, her voice tinged with doubt. "What if this momentum fades? What if people forget?" Maya placed a comforting hand on Olivia's. "You've already done more than most people ever will," she said. "You've started a conversation that needed to happen. And even if some people forget, others won't. You've planted seeds, Olivia, and those seeds will grow." The airline's transformation. Meanwhile, the airline that had once dismissed her now saw Olivia as an invaluable resource. They invited her to join their advisory board on diversity and inclusion, a position she accepted with cautious optimism. Her first meeting with the board was tense but productive. Olivia didn't hold back as she outlined the systemic changes she believed were necessary, not just for optics but for genuine progress. "It's not enough to say you're committed to diversity," she told the executives. "You have to show it in every decision you make, from hiring practices to customer interactions to the way you respond when something goes wrong." To their credit, the airline executives listened. Over time, they implemented many of Olivia's recommendations, including mandatory bias training for all employees, anonymous reporting systems for passengers and staff, and regular audits to assess the effectiveness of their efforts. A ripple effect. Other industries began to take notice of Olivia's work. Hotels, retail chains, and even tech companies reached out to her for advice on creating more inclusive environments. She was no longer just a voice for change in the airline industry. she had become a catalyst for a broader movement. One particularly poignant moment came when a major hotel chain unveiled a new training program inspired by Olivia's story. At the launch event, the CEO publicly thanked her for sparking the idea. "Your courage to speak out reminded us of the power of one voice," he said, "and we hope this program will amplify that voice, creating a ripple effect of empathy and understanding." A quiet victory. Despite her growing platform, Olivia remained deeply connected to the individuals who had reached out to her over the months. She made it a point to respond to as many emails and messages as she could, often staying up late into the night to do so. One day, she received an email that stopped her in her tracks. It was from Sarah, the flight attendant who had initially refused her seat. ***, Dear Olivia, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on what happened that day. I want to apologize again, not just for how I treated you, but for the assumptions I made. Your courage has made me realize how much I need to unlearn, and I'm committed to doing that work. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone like me who needed a wake-up call. I hope one day I can show you that I've truly changed. Sincerely, Sarah ***. Olivia stared at the email, her emotions a mix of surprise, relief, and hope. She hadn't expected to hear from Sarah, let alone receive such a heartfelt apology. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions could lead to profound transformations, a future of hope. As Olivia reflected on the journey she had been on, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had turned a moment of adversity into a movement for change, and she knew her work was far from over. Her story had become a beacon of hope for those who felt unseen, a rallying cry for those who demanded better, and a lesson for those who needed to change. And as she looked ahead, Olivia felt certain of one thing. She wasn't just fighting for a seat on a plane anymore. She was fighting for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could take their rightful place. The journey was just beginning. A legacy in motion. The months turned into a year, and Olivia's life had transformed in ways she never could have anticipated. The woman who had boarded a flight expecting nothing more than a quiet journey had become a prominent figure in the fight against systemic bias. Her story had evolved into something larger than herself, a catalyst for change in industries and communities worldwide. Despite her public role, Olivia often found herself reflecting privately on the personal cost of her journey. She had faced criticism, doubt, and scrutiny from strangers and peers alike. Yet, with every challenge, she reminded herself of the people who had reached out to thank her, to share their own stories, and to tell her that her voice had inspired them to stand up in their own lives. An unexpected honor. One crisp autumn morning, Olivia was sitting in her apartment reviewing notes for an upcoming panel discussion when her phone buzzed with a call from Michelle. "Are you sitting down?" Michelle asked, her voice brimming with excitement. "I am now," Olivia replied, sensing something big was coming. "You've been selected to receive the National Justice Award this year," Michelle said, her words rushing out in a burst of joy. Olivia froze. The National Justice Award was one of the highest honors given to individuals who had made significant contributions to advancing equality and human rights. I don't even know what to say," Olivia stammered. "Say yes," Michelle said with a laugh. "You deserve this. They're recognizing everything you've done, not just for yourself, but for so many others." As Olivia hung up the phone, a mix of emotions washed over her. The recognition was an incredible honor, but it also felt surreal. She thought back to the flight, to the moment when she had been told she couldn't sit in the seat she had paid for. She never could have imagined that moment would lead her here. The ceremony. The award ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., at a grand hall filled with activists, leaders, and changemakers from across the country. As Olivia entered the room, she was struck by the magnitude of the event. Giant banners hung from the ceiling, each bearing the names and faces of past recipients, civil rights leaders, educators, and trailblazers who had paved the way for justice and equality. When Olivia's name was announced, the room erupted into applause. She walked to the stage, her heart pounding but her steps steady. The bright lights felt both overwhelming and energizing as she approached the podium. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "This award is not just for me. It's for every person who has ever been told they don't belong. For every voice that has been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. This is for all of us." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "A year ago, I was just trying to take my seat on a plane. What I didn't realize was that I was also claiming my place in a larger fight, a fight for fairness, dignity, and respect. And while this journey has been unexpected, it has also been deeply humbling." Olivia's speech touched on the lessons she had learned, the progress that had been made, and the work that still lay ahead. She ended with a call to action. Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when we come together, when we listen, when we stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. My story may have started on a plane, but it's part of a much larger narrative. And it's a story we all have the power to rewrite. The standing ovation that followed felt like a moment frozen in time. Olivia stood on the stage, the weight of the journey she had undertaken lifting, replaced by a profound sense of purpose, creating lasting impact. After the ceremony, Olivia returned to her advocacy work with renewed energy, but she also began to focus on creating lasting, systemic change. She launched a nonprofit organization called Equity in Action, dedicated to addressing bias and promoting inclusivity across industries. The nonprofit's mission was clear: to provide education, resources, and tools for companies and individuals to identify and dismantle systemic inequalities. Olivia worked tirelessly to recruit a diverse team of experts, activists, and advisors who shared her vision. Equity in Action quickly gained traction, securing partnerships with major corporations and community organizations. They developed comprehensive training programs, created anonymous reporting tools, and hosted workshops to foster meaningful dialogue about race, privilege, and inclusion. Reconnecting with Sarah. One of the most unexpected moments of Olivia's journey came when she received an email from Sarah, the former flight attendant whose actions had sparked the entire incident. Sarah's message was heartfelt and vulnerable. She shared how the aftermath of the flight had been a turning point for her, forcing her to confront the biases she hadn't realized she carried. She wrote about attending workshops, reading books on racial equity, and seeking to better understand the experiences of people of color. "I want to thank you for standing up that day," Sarah wrote. "It was a wake-up call I didn't know I needed. I hope one day we can meet, so I can apologize to you in person." Olivia replied with compassion, acknowledging Sarah's growth and expressing hope for a future meeting. A few months later, that meeting happened. They sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop, sharing an emotional conversation about mistakes, accountability, and the power of change. A global movement. As Equity in Action grew, so did Olivia's influence. She began traveling internationally, sharing her story and advocating for change on a global scale. From corporate boardrooms in Tokyo to community centers in Johannesburg, Olivia spoke to audiences of all backgrounds, encouraging them to challenge their assumptions and create more inclusive spaces. One day, while addressing a group of young activists in London, Olivia was asked what kept her going. "Knowing that this isn't just about me," she said. "It's about the people I meet along the way. The young woman who sent me an email saying she felt seen for the first time. The employee who told me their company finally started listening because of our work. It's those moments that remind me why I do this." A legacy of hope. Years later, Olivia's story continued to inspire. Equity in Action had become a global organization, and Olivia had authored a best-selling book titled Taking the Seat, A Journey Toward Justice. The book combined her personal story with practical insights on fighting bias and creating change, earning praise from activists and educators alike. But for Olivia, the greatest reward wasn't the accolades or the recognition. It was the knowledge that her actions had made a difference, that her decision to speak up had sparked a ripple effect, touching lives she would never even know. As she sat on her balcony one evening, looking out at the city skyline, Olivia felt a profound sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had taken her seat, not just on a plane, but in a movement that would continue to grow long after she was gone. And in that moment, she knew her legacy wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever dared to stand up, speak out, and demand better. And it would endure, lighting the way for generations to come.